This series is meant to be watched in order. If you haven't seen the previous episodes, then we highly suggest you watch those first in order to get the most benefit. Please check the description below for the links to the other episodes. All right, everyone, we've come to it at last. The topic I think we've all been waiting for, rhythm. In our last episode, we talked about melody and harmony, and I laid out a couple of principles from Scripture, I believe, that shows us that God is a God of oneness and a God of unity. And we're going to review that a little bit today. But before we get into that, I want us to take a look at a video that we watched in the previous episode. This is Kirk Franklin responding to a choir from Oakwood University named the Aeolians. And I want you to see how he describes the music of this choir.
Well, I was 18 years old, and I met a guy by the name of Gerald Wright, and he was Seventh-day Adventist. I'd never heard of what the Seventh-day Adventist faith was, but I was homeless. And Gerald and his wife let me come live with them. But listening to that sound, all it made me do was think of him, because it's so heavenly that you're standing on, to be able to get a sound that all you sound like you auto-tune. Do they not sound auto-tune?
Especially the sopranos.
The sopranos sound auto-tune. It's like you singing like you freaking auto-tune. I have never, like you hear no rub.
No rub.
There's no rub. And it was so otherworldly. It just made me deeply miss him. Because if it wasn't for him letting me sleep on that couch, I would never be able to be here to enjoy the beauty of this moment.
So you see him laying down on the floor, turning around and looking at people and marveling at the beauty of the music that he was listening to. You heard him yourself call the music heavenly, and he even said that there was no rub in the music. And unless I'm mistaken, he was basically trying to say that there was no discord or dissonance in what he was hearing. He was basically hearing what he believed was perfect heavenly music. Based on my understanding, I believe that he described the music as heavenly for these reasons. Number one, the words were God-centered. It was melodious. It was harmonious. It had a proper tempo to it. The melody was dominant, and it was not dominated by rhythm. And finally, it was free from rhythmic discord. Now let's take a listen to some other music to see if we can spot the differences.
Since I've been 150, tried to rob me. He can't, 'cause God's got me. See, I'm God's property. Jesus is prodigy. Dope as ever, probably.
In my understanding, I believe that there is a clear difference between those two pieces of music. Now, that doesn't mean that I believe that we should only sing a cappella. Obviously not. The Bible talks about the proper use of instruments. However, as we saw in the previous episode, we need to see how to properly use these instruments so that we can follow God after the due order. Now, before we go any further, I want to set some context for what we're going to be talking about today. Because when it comes to this issue of music, you and I will have to decide if we want to follow God after the due order, if we want to offer to God a more excellent sacrifice. And to help you find that out, I want to take a trip back in time to King Solomon to take a look at something that he did that set the entire nation of Israel on the wrong path to false worship. In 1 Kings chapter 3, it says, "And Solomon made affinity with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David, until he had made an end of building his own house, and the house of the Lord, and the wall of Jerusalem round about." Now don't miss this. Only the people sacrificed in high places, because there was no house built unto the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and burnt incense in high places. So this was a little bit of a stain on Solomon's record. And the Bible is basically saying here that at the time, the people did not have a proper place to worship God. And so what they did is they went to the heathen high places and began worshiping there. And Solomon was the one that led out in this, and eventually the entire nation followed his lead. So basically what they did was they took something that was not of God, that was of the world, and they went there and blended their worship with it. I want us to get a little bit more detail in exactly what happened. So let's take a look at this quote. It says, Solomon changed his place of worship to Jerusalem, but his former act in sacrificing in a place not made sacred by the presence of the Lord, but dedicated to the worship of idols, removed from the minds of the people something of the repulsion with which they should have regarded the horrible performances practiced by idolaters. And I want you to notice that, the horrible performances practiced by idolaters. And it also said that these places were dedicated to idols. In other words, it was a different religion, it was false worship, and they blended it with the worship of God. Does that sound familiar with what we saw in episode 1 of this series, where we saw how the music is being taken from the world and brought and being baptized into the church? This is exactly, in principle, the same thing that happened in the days of Solomon. Let's go on and get some more details. It says, this mingling of the sacred and the profane was the first step in the practice of Solomon, which led him to suppose that the Lord was not so particular in regard to the worship of his people. Thus he was educating himself to make still great departures from God and his work. Little by little, his heathen wives led him to make them altars on which to sacrifice to their gods. So basically, Solomon assumed that God was not so particular about worship. And this is exactly what is happening today, as many of us believe that we can give God whatever we want based on our tastes and our understanding. But remember, God is asking for us to sing with understanding. Now, I want you to notice this statement about the high places. It says, as with Jehoash and Amaziah, the reforms of Azariah did not reach far enough. Each of these kings stopped short of removing the high places, these traditional places of sacrifice to the Lord. We could say that these idolatrous high places were King Azariah's, except what is yours? Now, these statements are telling us that Solomon left the high places and began worshiping at Jerusalem. But because of that influence, it paved the way for him to turn away from God later on, because he had already made compromises in his life. And that influence went on to the other kings of Israel for centuries at a time. I want you to look at a few of these kings. This is Jehoash. It says, and Jehoash did that which was right in the sight of the Lord all his days, wherein Jehoiada the priest instructed him. But the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burnt incense in the high places. So Jehoash was looked at as someone who was following God. However, he did not follow God all the way, and he left the high places. And as a result of his influence, the people also worshiped at the high places. Let's take a look at another king. This is Amaziah. And remember, these are kings of Judah who were recognized as men that feared God. It says, and he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, yet not like David his father. And I want you to notice that, yet not like David his father. He did according to all things as Joash his father did. Howbeit, the high places were not taken away. As yet the people did sacrifice and burnt incense on the high places. Azariah, the same thing. He did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, except that the high places were not removed. The people sacrificed and burnt incense still on the high places. Uzziah, he also did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. Same thing. Howbeit, the high places were not removed. And so we have all these kings. They loved God, but they did not remove the high places. But there were two kings that did remove the high places, and one was Hezekiah. It says that, and he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that David his father did. So notice this distinction is made back to David and following all that David did, because David followed God after the due order. It says, he removed the high places and brake the images and cut down the groves. Next up is King Josiah, which is actually my son's name. It says of him, and he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. And just like Hezekiah, it says, and walked in the ways of David his father, and declined neither to the right hand nor to the left. For in the 8th year of his reign, while he was yet young, he began to seek after the God of David his father. And in the 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem from the high places, and the groves, and the carved images, and the molten images. And so you and I need to ask ourselves today, how serious are we about worshiping God according to what he wants? And are we willing to take away the high places like Hezekiah and Josiah? Or are we content to serve God, but to hold on to the high places? I want you to keep this in mind as we go forward and talk about rhythm, because this is a question that each and every one of us has to answer individually. And remember, we're talking about worshiping God, and so we have to give him what he desires. As we saw in the last episode, this is the principle that should guide all of our decisions. It says music forms a part of God's worship in the courts above. And in our songs of praise, we should try to approach as nearly as possible to the harmony of the heavenly choirs. Now, in the previous episode, we talked about the importance of harmony and unison when it comes to God and everything that is related to God, including music. And we ended by taking a look at this quote from the Great Controversy in describing the universe after the end of sin. It says, "The great controversy is ended. Sin and sinners are no more. The entire universe is clean. One pulse of harmony and gladness beats throughout the vast creation." Now notice those two words there, pulse and beats. These two words are directly related to rhythm. Now, this statement obviously is not talking about music, but it is describing the desire that God has for there to be unity and harmony throughout his creation. And we also saw that Satan disturbed that harmony when he sinned in heaven. So with those two words in mind, we're going to take a look at a clip discussing rhythm. But before we do, we want to understand, what does rhythm mean? Rhythm is defined as movement or procedure with uniform or patterned recurrence of a beat, accent, or the like. When it comes to music, the pattern of a regular or irregular pulses caused in music by the occurrence of strong and weak melodic and harmonic beats. And so based on this definition, and based on the statement that we read from the Great Controversy, and based on what we saw in the previous presentation, I am laying forth to you today that harmony does not just apply to musical notes, but that harmony also applies to rhythm. And so with this in mind, let's take a look at this clip from a documentary named How Music Works to find out a little bit more about what rhythm is.
Rhythm is the maverick in the musical toolbox. Of all music's components, rhythm is the most independent. Even without a melody, a bass line, or harmony, a rhythmic pattern can stand on its own 2 feet. Rhythm is the part of music that interacts most immediately and spontaneously with our bodies. Without it, music would be pleasant enough, but it would be brain food. With rhythm, though, music becomes hypnotic and sensuous. What is it about rhythm that makes it so irresistible? Why do we surrender to it so easily? In this program, I'm going to put it under the microscope. We're going to find out how rhythm works. Different music from different places and different times, but they all share the same appeal. They all make us want to tap our feet, get up and dance, and sway to the beat. Rhythm is addictive and intoxicating, but it can also be fantastically complex, and we're going to explore its many forms in this program. At its core, though, there's one simple and fundamental ingredient. At the heart of all rhythm lies the concept of the beat, or the pulse. Our first sensation of pulse, of course, was that of our mother's heartbeat in the womb. But all mammals experience their mother's heartbeat, and only we humans like to dance, tap our feet, or play the castanets.
All right, so there was a lot that was said in that video, so let's take a moment to just look at the key points. It says rhythm is the part of music that interacts most immediately and spontaneously with our bodies. It was described that rhythm can be hypnotic and sensuous, irresistible, and that we surrender to it so easily. It was also said that it can be addictive and intoxicating. Now, of course, rhythm in and of itself is not evil. I want to make that very, very clear. Just like melody and harmony in and of itself is not evil. However, it can be twisted from the purity of what God desires into something that is evil. And this is where music can become sensuous. This is where music can become addictive and intoxicating and make us surrender to it so easily. So why does this happen? Why is it that certain types of rhythm are so intoxicating? In order to really understand this, we need to understand that Lucifer, who we now know as Satan, was the lead musician in heaven. And even the very way that he was created as a musical being. And we find this in Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 13. In speaking of Lucifer, it says, "Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created." And so we see here that Lucifer somehow was created internally with tabrets, which is a percussion instrument, and pipes, which indicate melody. The reason this is important is because Lucifer, being a master of music, can manipulate music, whether it's the pipes or the tabrets, or in other words, whether it's the melody or the rhythm. So obviously in heaven, rhythm exists, and so does melody. And from the statements we read in the previous presentation, harmony exists as well. But we need to understand what is pure rhythm, what is pure harmony, and what is pure melody. This is the understanding that we need to come to. When the Bible talks about tabrets, it's talking about a timbrel, a tambourine, as I already said, some type of percussion instrument. And in commenting on the timbrel, it says, "A timbrel held and struck with hand, especially by dancing women, often with other musical instruments, a sign of merriment, gladness. It can also be used for revelry. It can be used for exaltation, triumph. It was used by prophets in ecstasy and also for praise." And so again, we need to keep in mind that a percussion instrument in and of itself is not evil, just like a piano or a flute or a guitar in and of itself is not evil. However, it can be used for evil. In talking about those prophets, this is the story from 1 Samuel chapter 10, when Saul was about to be anointed as king. And it says, "After that, thou shalt come to the hill of God, where is the garrison of the Philistines. And it shall come to pass, when thou shalt come thither to the city, that thou shalt meet a company of prophets coming down from the high place with a psaltery and a tabret and a pipe and a harp before them, and they shall prophesy. And the Spirit of the Lord will come upon thee, and thou shalt prophesy with them, and shalt be turned into another man." So here we see these prophets. They're full of the Holy Spirit, and they're prophesying. And it says that they had a psaltery, a tabret, a pipe, and a harp. Because, as I said, instruments in and of themselves are not evil or good inherently. However, it is how these instruments are used, and God wants us to understand how to use these instruments after the due order. Timbrels are also mentioned in Psalm 149, verse 3. It says, "Let them praise his name in the dance. Let them sing praises unto him with the timbrel and harp." Psalm 150, verse 4. It says, "Praise him with the timbrel and dance. Praise him with stringed instruments and organs." Exodus 15, verse 20. "And Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and dances." Now here's the thing. I can assure you that the type of dancing that the Bible is describing in Psalm 149 and 150, and the dancing of Miriam and the other women after the victory against the Egyptians, was not the type of sensuous dancing that we see today. And what we're going to see is that the type of music that is played and created will drive and dictate how people are dancing. So even in that, it's important for us to have proper understanding. Now, before we move forward, I want to do a quick refresher in what we looked at in the previous episode to really emphasize this point that God is a God of oneness, and the due order that David established was founded in this principle of oneness. In 2 Chronicles 5, verse 13, when it talks about the dedication of the temple, it says that the trumpeters and singers were as one to make one sound to be heard in praising and thanking the Lord. Another version says they were heard harmoniously praising. Another says that they all sounded together. They were heard in unison. They sounded like one person, performed in unison. And we found that that word unison means harmonious agreement or union, concord, perfect agreement, to harmonize exactly, and finally at the same time. And based on the understanding that God is a God of oneness, this principle of unison will apply to harmony, meaning that perfect heavenly music is free from discord. And I believe that it will also apply to rhythm. And we're going to see that playing out. Just to reiterate, the Bible says, can two walk together except they be agreed? And I want you to keep this particular verse in mind about walking together unless they be agreed as we look at syncopation in just a moment. Jesus' desire that we all be one as he and the Father are one. And also in Acts chapter 2, we see that the disciples were in one accord, meaning that they were in harmony. Everything about God is founded in harmony. Now, with this idea of oneness, unison, and harmony in mind, let's take a look at another clip from this documentary to start taking a look at everyone's favorite topic, syncopation.
We've made a pulse, we've played around with its speed, we've subdivided it into smaller units, and we've given those units accents. Our voyage of rhythmic discovery is almost complete, but not quite. Subdividing beats and giving them accents has one important side effect that has given an extra charge to rhythm of excitement and energy over the centuries, but particularly in the 20th and 21st. This side effect is called syncopation. It's music's red light district, where rhythm gets loose, playful, and mischievous. Syncopation was a term that cropped up a lot in the 1920s during the jazz boom to describe jazz's new jerky rhythms.
So we saw that it said there that when it comes to rhythm, syncopation is where the music gets loose, playful, and mischievous, calling syncopation music's red light district. And if you don't know what the red light district is, it's basically a place where some not so nice things happen. But anyway, moving on. Let's take a look at this statement from Story of Redemption, page 31. This is talking about the Garden of Eden before Adam and Eve sinned. It says, Adam and Eve assured the angels that they should never transgress the express command of God, for it was their highest pleasure to do his will. The angels united with Adam and Eve, and listen to this, in holy strains of harmonious music. And as their music pealed forth from blissful Eden, Satan heard the sound of their strains of joyful adoration to the Father and Son. And as Satan heard it, his envy, hatred, and malignity increased, and he expressed his anxiety to his followers to incite them, Adam and Eve, to disobedience, and at once bring down the wrath of God upon them, and change their songs of praise to hatred and curses to their Maker. So Satan heard this harmonious music, and he was furious, and he wanted to change these songs into songs of hatred for their Maker. Now, what Satan wanted to do is he wanted to do the same thing he did in heaven. He wanted to disrupt the harmony in the Garden of Eden and introduce discord. And discord means being at variance, disagreeing, not being in accord, conflicting, disagreeable in sound, harsh, or dissonant. And remember that statement we read in the previous episode where we saw that the music of heaven was different from the music here on earth, and that the music on earth sounded harsh and discordant. We also read in the previous presentation that the music of heaven was perfect. It was perfectly harmonious, and that we should strive as nearly as possible to reach that perfection. Now, obviously, we are imperfect beings that live in an imperfect world, and we may not be able to reach that ultimate goal. But, however, we should strive to reach that goal, and when we do that, God will honor and bless our efforts. Now, in talking about the perfection and the imperfection of music, I want us to take a look at a statement from this article entitled, What is Syncopation in Music and Why It Matters? It says, emphasizing notes outside a constant pulse allows you to create interesting rhythms when recording or performing. It will also give your music a more human quality. Music that plays only on the beat can sound static, boring, machine-like. It lacks imperfect aspects that make music relatable. By using syncopation, artists can make that imperfection sound good. Now notice what this is saying. This is saying that there is perfect music and then there is imperfect music. And I'm not saying that God wants us to be robotic. However, if we follow the principles of godly music, we will have room for expression. However, God gives us those safety lines to remain in so that we don't go too far to the left or too far to the right. Here's another definition talking about syncopation. It says, more simply, syncopation is a general term for a disturbance or interruption of the regular flow of rhythm, a placement of rhythmic stresses or accents where they wouldn't normally occur. When it comes to those words of disturbance and interruption of a rhythm, when it's talking about the heart rhythm, That's actually a negative thing when the heart gets disturbed or interrupted from the normal rhythm of the heart. And I wonder if the disturbance of rhythm in music could also be looked at as a negative thing. I wonder if the idea of unison versus discord can apply to rhythm. In this article, it says, in music, unison is two or more musical parts that sound either the same pitch or pitches separated by intervals of one or more octaves, usually at the same time. And that's rhythm language. It goes on and it says, rhythmic unison is another term for homorhythm. In music, homorhythm is a texture where there is a sameness of all rhythm in all parts, or very similar rhythm, as would be used in simple hymn or chorale settings. In contrast to this, we have something called polyrhythm, another form of syncopation. It says polyrhythm is the simultaneous use of two or more conflicting rhythms that are not readily perceived as deriving from one another, or as simple manifestations of the same meter. The rhythmic conflict may be the basis of an entire piece of music, cross rhythm, or a momentary disruption. Now, those were a lot of words that maybe some of us don't really fully understand. So let's take a look at another clip from this documentary to find out what the experts say about this topic of syncopation. And remember, this particular documentary is not looking at syncopation as a negative thing. It's actually looking at it as a positive thing. And so I love that because they're going to speak very openly and honestly about how they feel about it without any filters. So let's go ahead and take a look.
Though, believe it or not, both the term and the phenomenon had been around for ages. Syncopation is a musical sleight of hand, whereby you sneakily shift a beat slightly ahead of or slightly behind where you expect it to be. It makes music sound more fun, basically. Instead of sounding mechanical, mathematical, and machine-like, it makes things sound human and quirky. Here's a simple example from Bach. It's a short keyboard piece, an invention, and this is what it would sound like without its syncopation. But this is what Bach actually wrote. My right hand, the upper part, is being deliberately delayed by a half beat all the way through the phrase. This, in its crudest form, is syncopation.
Let's take a moment to recap what was said. It says that syncopation is a musical sleight of hand, where you sneakily shift a beat ahead of or slightly behind where it's supposed to be. And there was an example of music that was given for us to decide which one we liked better. Now, obviously, that was syncopation in its crudest form, but I think that we can all agree that the music was no longer in unison, and that's the point. There is a oneness, harmony, and unity to the music of heaven that is described in the spirit of prophecy and that we see in 2 Chronicles chapter 5. And so the introduction of discord can be a negative thing when it comes to harmony, and it can also be a negative thing when it comes to syncopation and rhythm. Take a look at this other definition of syncopation. It says in music, syncopation includes a variety of rhythms which are in some way unexpected in that they deviate from the strict succession of regularly placed strong and weak beats in a meter and pulse. These include a stress on a normally unstressed beat or a rest where one would normally be stressed. If a part of the measure that is usually unstressed is accented, the rhythm is considered to be syncopated. And so in essence, this is saying that syncopation is a deviation from the oneness of the music to something else. And so you and I have to decide if we want to strive as much as possible to reach the unity and the harmony of the music of heaven when we're talking about worshiping God. This is a statement from another article entitled, "What is Syncopation in Music?" And it really highlights the point that I've been trying to make, that dissonance and discord can apply to rhythm the same way it applies to harmony. It says, "You're missing out on a whole world of enjoyment if you stick to strict rhythms. Syncopation is, in other words, what dissonance and melody are, but to the beat. It creates a need for resolution and motivates us to move forward." Essentially, this is saying that that disturbance, that dissonance, that discord in the rhythm is what is driving us to move. And unfortunately, sometimes it can drive us to move in the wrong way, as we're going to see in just a moment. This is a video clip from an interview with Michael Jackson talking about the topic of rhythm and dancing. I want you to listen very carefully to what he has to say when he's asked a very pointed question regarding what some people have perceived as a very sensuous and sexual way for him to dance.
I have to ask you this. So many mothers in my audience have said to please ask you this question.
Yeah.
Why do you always grab your crotch?
Why do I grab my crotch?
Yeah, why? We think you got a thing with your crotch going on
I think
here.
it happens subliminally. When I dance, if you're a dancer, you know, you're just interpreting the sounds and the accompaniment of the music. If there's a driving bass, you become the bass. If there's a cello, if there's a string, you become that. So you become the emotion of what that sound is, okay? So if I'm doing a movement and I go bam, and I grab myself, it's the music that compels me to do it. It's not saying I'm getting ready to grab down there and it's not a great place. You don't think about it, it just happens. Sometime I'll look back at the footage and I'll go, did I do that?
Yeah.
So I'm slave to the rhythm,
Yeah.
okay?
I think the alarm's going off in the house. I don't know why. But we're going to fix it in a minute. We're in live television, so we're going to go to break. These things happen. We'll be right back.
Well, just like Oprah, I don't know why the fire alarm went off either, but maybe somebody didn't want us to hear something. So let's take a look at what he said. He said the suggestive way that he dances, that it kind of happens subliminally. He says when you're a dancer, you're just interpreting the sounds and the accompaniment. He said if there's a driving bass, you become the bass. Or if it's a cello, you become the cello. He said you become the emotion of what that sound is. And then he says that the music is compelling him to grab himself. He doesn't think about it, it just happens. Why? Because he said that he's a slave to the rhythm. Now, in light of that, let's read a few words from a very popular song from the 80s called The Rhythm Is Gonna Get You. It says, at night when you turn off all the lights, there's no place you can hide. Oh no, the rhythm is gonna get you. In bed, throw the covers on your head. You pretend like you're dead, but I know it, the rhythm is gonna get you. No way you can fight it every day, but no matter what you say, you know it, the rhythm is gonna get you. No clue of what's happening to you, and before this night is through, the rhythm is gonna get you. You see, I love to read the words for what they are. I love to listen to people who are not Christians talk about these topics because they talk about it openly and honestly, and they tell us what it is. I mean, take a look at this baby dancing to heavy metal music. The music is dictating how he's dancing. I've experienced this several times with my son when we go out to the supermarket, or I remember one time we went to Barnes and Nobles and a certain song came on and I saw my son moving in a way that I know he has never seen before. I know I didn't show it to him. I know my wife didn't show it to him. I mean, it's obvious that music can drive us to do certain things. But just like Michael Jackson said, the music was telling him when he was 5 years old, that music that he heard in that Barnes and Nobles that day told him exactly how to move. Certain rhythms drive certain behaviors. Certain rhythms drive certain dancing. Certain rhythms, if we allow it, can take us to a place that we don't want to be. And unfortunately, in my experience, it's only Christians that try to pretend that certain rhythms don't have a certain effect on you. Now, am I saying that everyone that listens to a song with a syncopated rhythm is going to get possessed by demons? No, obviously I'm not saying that at all. However, we need to be very careful in what we're selecting to listen to, and we need to be even more respectful of God when we're talking about offering him music. And that is why I believe that as much as we understand, we should try to offer God the perfection of music that he's looking for. We may not reach that perfection, but we can still do our best, and God will honor our efforts. So, what is it exactly that drives us to move in a certain way when certain rhythms are played? Let's take a look at this clip to find out.
This syncopation is now so common in popular music that it's quite forgotten its roots in Cuba. What it is a kind of mirror image of swing in jazz. It hasn't got a name, but this is what it does. In jazz, we saw how Fats Waller, Louis Armstrong and others like to delay the melody a little to give it a degree of elasticity against the main beat in the drums or the bass. In Cuban son, the elasticity is in the other direction. It is anticipating the main beat, not delaying it. I can show you how this works with 3 runners. Imagine the middle one is the pace setter, running along at a regular, fixed pulse. Then on the inside lane, runner 2 is trying to keep up with her, but is ever so slightly behind the pulse. Runner 2 is like swing in jazz. Runner 3, on the other hand, has a bit of Cuban blood in her. She's slightly ahead of the pace. She's the equivalent of the rhythm of Cuban son. In Cuban son, two things are pushing ahead, the melody and the bass line. It's generally agreed that the fact that the bass jumps ahead is one of the reasons why son has been the starting point for so many dance beats. It's almost as if it's pushing your feet to move. A famous example of son is El Guantanamo by Ignacio Piñero, one of the legendary pioneers of Havana son. In it, the melody and the bass line both anticipate the main beat. This is what the melody would sound like without the preemptive rhythm. And this is what it's like with it. Now I'm going to add the bass to that tune played absolutely straight. But in the actual song, the bass is pushed as well, a bit like this.
So what we saw there were two types of syncopation where one delays the rhythm and one pushes it forward. And it's like it almost drives you to start dancing and to start dancing in a certain way. But I thought it was so interesting, the graphic that was used with three runners, the middle one being the actual rhythm, and then the other two on the left and the right being jazz and the more Cuban style music. But the point that was being made is that these runners were no longer running together. And so I want to ask you the question. When it comes to music, can two run together unless they be agreed? Or as the book of Amos puts it, can two walk together unless they be agreed? When we have the introduction of syncopation, we no longer have agreement in the rhythm, and we have deviated from oneness, from harmony, and we have introduced discord and dissonance to the rhythm. Now, what about the other type of syncopation called polyrhythms? Polyrhythm is the simultaneous use of two or more rhythms that are not readily perceived as deriving from one another, or as simple manifestations of the same meter. In other words, they're no longer being played at the same time. Polyrhythms require at least two rhythms to be played concurrently, one of which is typically an irrational rhythm. What this simply means is that every song has a rhythm, and when we introduce another rhythm on top of that, what we have done is introduced rhythmic discord, rhythmic dissonance, and we no longer have oneness. The equivalent to this in melody is if one person was playing in one key and another person was playing in another key. It would sound a little something like this.
Discord or dissonance is where there is a deliberate collision of notes that aren't supposed to fit together, when they belong to the wrong triads, for instance.
That is discord at its worst. So with this idea of polyrhythms in mind, and this idea of unity and oneness and harmony that we've been talking about, let's take a look at another clip from this documentary so that we can understand a little bit more of what polyrhythms are, and we can determine for ourselves if they violate this principle of oneness that's laid out in the Bible and the spirit of prophecy.
All the syncopations we've encountered so far have taken a steady beat and messed about with what you're expecting it to do. But there's another type of syncopation that rhythm has up its sleeve, and it's devilishly sophisticated and devilishly exciting. Music has been immeasurably enriched by it, especially popular and dance music. So far, all our syncopations have been made by shifting an accent or emphasis from one beat to another. But there's another species of syncopation which goes one step further. It takes a whole rhythm pattern with all its associated accents and superimposes it upon another. It's a technique called cross rhythm, and it's as old as the hills, or at least it is in Africa, where musicians have been doing it pretty much forever. We'll begin with a relatively straightforward cross rhythm, one that even a classically trained musician like me would be able to manage. It involves the superimposition of a 3-beat pattern over a 2-beat pattern in the same amount of time. So we start with our basic 2-beat pattern. Then we'll make 3 beats fit on top of them. Just for fun, I'm going to get Owen and Oliver to swap beats mid-flow. You can see why our ancestors really liked this cross rhythm, can't you? It's dead flashy and it makes the rhythm really motor along. But you don't have to thwack it out on a pair of drums to feel the effect of this 3 against 2 pattern. Here it is in a piece by Brahms. But superimposing 3 over 2 is child's play for an African drummer. For a start, it only involves 2 players. Expertly orchestrated good African drum patterns can involve half a dozen or more separate drum patterns on top of each other, involving a dozen or more players, and the results can be breathtakingly exciting.
All right, so when it's talking about polyrhythms, let's find out what the experts have to say. And remember, they are neutral. They don't look at this as a negative thing. They're just simply talking about it for what it is. They said, it messed about with what you're expecting. They said it's devilishly sophisticated and devilishly exciting. It said that they were superimposing many rhythms on top of each other, and it's used especially in pop and dance music. What we also saw in that clip is that rhythmic discord can be found in classical music as well. And finally, we found that up to half a dozen different rhythms can be played in the same song. So obviously, if you have 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 rhythms all going on at the same time, you will obviously have rhythmic dissonance that should be avoided when offering music to God. In talking about where syncopation is used, it says all dance music makes use of syncopation, and it's often a vital element that helps tie the whole track together. In the form of a backbeat, syncopation is usually in virtually all contemporary popular music. So this is the key thing to understand. Whatever your understanding of music is, God is looking for us to strive as nearly as possible to the harmony of heaven. So what that means for each individual is to look at your understanding to find out if what you're offering to God is one sound, is harmonious, or if what you're offering to God is full of discord and dissonance, whether that's in the melody, the harmony, or the rhythm. Obviously, one of the most popular forms of music today is hip-hop. And this documentary basically brought out that hip-hop is even another form of syncopation, as the voice is another layer of the instrument. So let's take a moment to look at another clip from this documentary to understand a little more about hip-hop.
The overlaying of one rhythm pattern over another has been given a fresh slant in recent years with the development of one of the most widespread and influential of modern techniques, rap. In rap, a percussion section, usually electronic, lays down a basic ground pattern over which the spoken voice enters with its own often very complicated pattern whose rhythmic shape is determined solely by the choice of words. The voice in rap is behaving like a percussion instrument. This can be demonstrated by taking a hip-hop vocal line and turning it into pure rhythm pattern. Hope is a hybrid song with a rapping verse from Twister and a gospel-inspired chorus from singer Faith Evans. When Twister begins his verse, the real rhythmic action and vitality is provided not by the drum kit playing the ground beat, but by the percussive energy of his voice. We can break this rhythm down to its essentials. Owen here will play us the rhythmic pattern of the ground beat. While Oliver will play the pattern Twister is rapping.
then one day they could speak again. I wish that we only saw good news every time we look at CNN.
It's immediately obvious that the voices pattern is much more complicated than the backing track.
All right, so as we look at that, this is probably why when I was growing up and my parents heard me listening to rap and hip hop, that they would say to me that that's not music. It's because when we're talking about music in light of having melody and harmony, it's basically a rhythm dominant music. And so I'll let you decide if that violates the oneness and harmony that we've been talking about in light of the due order and the perfect music and harmony of heaven. As we're coming to a close, I want us to take a moment to look at what some would call a pagan worship service from the island that I was born on, Jamaica. And then after that, we're going to take a look at how these rhythms were taken from these worship styles and then put into popular music. Now, as we look at and listen to this video, I want you to pay close attention to the rhythms, and then I'm going to play another song after that, and you're going to see the exact same rhythms being used.
These Maroons are carrying on the nearly extinct communal music and dance, which is a remnant of the dance of the ancestral spirits, which have returned to this corporal world through the position of the living. The word comuna can be heard in their song.
All right, so you heard that example. Now let's listen to a reggae song, and you're going to hear pretty much the same exact types of rhythms being used in this song.
I could have who say granny no miserable. If you live with your granny, you will turn granny too.
And so what's the point of talking about this? What we see is something very similar that took place with Solomon, which we saw in the beginning of this presentation, where we saw that Solomon worshipped in the high places using things that were dedicated to idols, things that were used in false religion. And so the same thing is happening. And this is why in part 0.5 of this series, I made a very important point. This is not about culture. This is about religion, true religion and false religion. And what has happened over the years is that we have taken from pagan sources and offered that to God in worship. This is no different from the high places that Solomon worshiped at and the children of Israel worshiped at. And so the question that you and I need to answer today is if we're going to be like Josiah and Hezekiah, who tore down the high places when it came to the worship of God, or if we're going to leave the high places alone and offer to God a less excellent sacrifice. So where should our focus be in this time of Earth's history? This says, to everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. So God does say to praise him with the dance, but really, should this be the focus of our energy at this time in Earth's history? To answer that question, I want us to take a look at another verse in Isaiah chapter 5, verses 11 and 12. It says, "Woe unto them that rise up early in the morning, that they may follow strong drink, that continue until night, till wine inflame them, and the harp and the viol, the tabret and the pipe, and the wine are in their feast. But they regard not the work of the Lord, neither consider the operation of his hands." There are so many Christians today that are more interested in dancing and celebration and music than they are in doing the work of God and developing a deeper experience and connection with God. And how do I know this? This is what I want you to do. The next time you see a concert in your area, maybe it's with a popular gospel artist or gospel choir, I want you to go to that concert and I want you to look around in that room or that concert hall, and I want you to see how many people are in there. And I want you to see the enthusiasm that takes place with the people that are there when certain types of music are being played. And then the following Wednesday, I want you to go to prayer meeting at your church. And I want you to see how many people are there. And then the following Sabbath, I want you to go to Sabbath school. And I want you to see how many people are in Sabbath school on time. If you do that, you will be able to see where we are as a church at this time in Earth's history. The harp, the viol, the tabrets, and the pipe are in our concerts, but we do not regard the work of the Lord with the same passion that we put into music. And I believe that we've lost our way. When we're talking about the music that we're offering to God, by his grace, we need to have enough respect to follow him after the due order. We know that God is a God of unity, harmony, and oneness. I believe that that has been made clear. And I believe that that needs to apply to melody, to harmony, and also to rhythm. And so the choice is yours today. And this is the choice that you will have to make as you offer music to God. Are you interested in trying to approach as nearly as possible to the harmony of the heavenly choirs? Obviously, there is a difference between the syncopation that is found in this song and the syncopation that is found in this song.
Since I've been 150 tried to rob me. He can't, 'cause God's got me. See, I'm God's property.
And so we have a gradient. On one side, we have perfect music. And on the other side, we have whatever you think in your mind is the worst ungodly music that you can think of. Today, I'd like for you to prayerfully consider what you are offering to God based on your understanding, not anyone else's understanding, based on your understanding. In this little gradient that we see here, green being good and red being bad, where do you lie in the music that you offer to God in praise? Are you interested in taking away the high places? This is a decision that we have to make for ourselves. In this presentation, I purposely didn't go into any details of 3/4 time or 4/4 time or 9/8 or whatever the case may be. This is about simply understanding the principles and then in your understanding, you doing your best. Obviously, we live in an imperfect world, and it's going to be very difficult to find music that meets all of the principles. But basically, as I've reiterated, all we have to do is be sincere in our efforts, and God will accept our worship as perfect. And so as we each strive to make our choices, let's do so with the thought in mind of what God has done for us and how worthy He is of receiving the type of worship that He desires instead of giving Him what we desire. I hope to see you again for the next episode of Soundproof, where we'll take a look at the spiritual effects of music. Hope to see you again.